Hello, and welcome to Pixel Parenting, the podcast where we dive into the latest research and practical strategies for raising kids in our tech world. I'm your host, Patricia Kangas, and today we're tackling a hot topic at the crossroads of technology, law, and child safety. Tech policy shapes nearly every aspect of our digital lives, even more so for kids. Regulations and law determine how platforms handle personal data, moderate content, and implement safety features, which all directly impact the online environment where our children spend the time. As technology evolves rapidly, these policies sometimes lag behind, creating gaps that can expose kids to privacy risks or inappropriate content. And this isn't just an legal debate. This has real-world implications that affect the safety and quality of our kids' digital interactions. Our guest today is Abby Vollmer. Abby is a legal and policy expert in the tech industry. Abby brings a lot of experience from her roles at GitHub and Strava and now at Cloudflare. At GitHub, she was director of platform policy and headed the online safety team, educating policymakers and enforcing acceptable use policies and guiding product launches to mitigate abuse. At Strava, she advised on safety and privacy in the product, drafting key policies around generative AI and content moderation. Now at Cloudflare, Abby continues to lead on online trust, guided by a humans right-based approach as technology and legal requirements evolve. In this episode, we're going to explore Abby's unique role at the intersection of law, policy, and technology, discuss the challenges lawmakers face when crafting regulations that protect our kids online, and we will delve into the complexities tech companies encounter in meeting these evolving legal standards. Abby, welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Patricia. I'm really excited to be here today, too.
Okay, so let's just dive into it. Could you start sharing what your role entails and how it positions you at the intersection of tech, law, and policy?
Sure. Yeah, well, just recently I was hanging out with a friend from law school and his son asked me, so where do you work? And when I said I work at Cloudflare, he said, what's that? And I said, it's a tech company. He was like, wait, but I thought you were a lawyer. So, I think maybe just to start off, why do companies need to have lawyers in the mix? And, basically I would say whatever your products or services are, you're operating in places where there are laws and you need to make sure that your products and services comply with those laws. So generally, that's what the in-house counsel is doing. They're keeping an eye on those laws and advising the company. For me, my roles have been a bit different in each place, but they've all involved trust and safety. And, that part of the business, I think, is really important, especially thinking about the topics we're covering today and our focus on kids. When companies decide that they're going to launch products and services that might be used by kids, trust and safety is so important. And so a lot of companies have a dedicated team of professionals who are focused on preventing abuse of their product, which includes working with product teams, engineering teams, design teams to, when they're releasing features, think about ways to put safeguards into the product or otherwise steer people away from doing things they're not supposed to with the product. There's also a reactive component to it, where if you do see somebody's abusing the product, that you're able to report that to the company. And then you have the trust and safety team that is handling those reports of abuse and deciding how to enforce if people are actually violating the terms of service or laws. So, that's sort of my role in the legal profession, the legal space, is to advise the trust and safety teams, whether it's, the wording they use for the community guidelines or the kinds of tools we build for users to be able to control what they see, who they're seeing content from, transparency around if we are taking action.
And what about your role in policy, or what do you know about policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great question. So a lot of times when, you have lawyers that are working on trust and safety, there may or may not be a policy team or people working on policy focus on those issues. And I've been lucky to be able to work in that space. And why I say I'm lucky is because you have a lot of lawmakers that are focused or very concerned with online safety, kids' privacy. And sometimes people might have good intentions when they're trying to draft laws, but it's not always easy to know what the right words are to make sure that those laws will actually achieve their purpose and work in practice. And so working on trust and safety and policy means you get to interact with policymakers and help them better understand what the words that they're actually proposing will do in practice.
What's the difference between trust and safety policy, and then who makes sure that there's not actually being an abuse in whatever platform?
Policy comes up in different ways at different companies. There's like the public policy side of things, which is what I was describing a minute ago, which is more about external, like engaging externally with lawmakers and helping them understand how the technology works and how to propose approaches to promote safety. There's also the policy internally, and I did work on this as well, where you're setting those like community guidelines or acceptable use policies that say, hey, if you're going to use our product, you can't post content that has this, this, or this in it. Those kinds of rules that set the expectations across the community about like what you can and can't do with the product. And so there's policy on that side too, where it's like, what are the rules? So both of those things I think would count.
And who's the team that if somebody posts some content that, it's not allowed by the policy, what's the name of the team that actually flags that content?
Yeah, that's typically the trust and safety team would do that. So my role as a lawyer is not to actually flag that content, but if there are questions, if the trust and safety teams that are handling that content have questions about whether this actually did violate a policy, or maybe it's something that's not spelled out in our policies, but we realize this is something that we don't want on the platform, we're starting to see a new kind of abuse, then we work quickly to figure out how to update our policies and make clear to people that, hey, this is not a place where you can post that kind of stuff. A lot of companies, including the ones that I worked on, had, harassment mentioned in their policies, where like you can't post harassing content, but people are creative in the ways that they harass people, unfortunately. So let's take GitHub, for example. I mean, you may not be familiar with GitHub. Your audience may not know it. GitHub is the world's leading software developer platform. It's where developers write their code. It's also where they go look for code. It's where they build software projects. So many of the things that we rely on, the code is on GitHub. And you might think of it as just a code repository. How can there be, why do you even need a trust and safety team for code?
I'm surprised.
Yeah. And I mean, in general, almost all of the content that is on GitHub is not violating the terms of service or the law. But just like other forms of user-generated content, meaning where like a user can create their own content and share it with users, there's always that potential that they're going to be using language that could be harassing or hate speech, or they could upload a photo that has nudity or something in it. There's definitely the potential for people to do bad things with the product if you give them these tools. And so even though at GitHub the large majority of users are not abusing the product, it's important to have these rules in place. And so part of my job was working with the trust and safety team. With GitHub, honestly, a lot of it was more around copyright, because that's getting probably a little too in the weeds for this, but the software code is copyrightable. And so there are a lot of copyright disputes that get bubbled up to legal. But it is still important to have the general kinds of abuse accounted for, because again, if people have the ability to create content, there's always the possibility that they're going to create abusive content. And so, thinking about harassment, when we updated our acceptable use policies several years ago to have a specific page on a lot of these different restrictions. And so the bullying and harassment page gives these clear examples, and includes things like piling on, which, if you're a user and you're sort of wanting to argue when you're being told that you're harassing somebody because all you did was put a +1 on someone's comment, well, it's like if that's like a coordinated thing and 50 different users are like piling on to some other existing behavior, in certain contexts, that can be enough to like pretty clearly look like harassment. So the user who's sort of potentially trolling you to say, I didn't do anything wrong, you might try to, just hold on to the fact that all I did was this, I just did what this other person did or whatever. So we really want to make it clear that that kind of coordinated behavior is not okay. Because as you know, as a human being, when you get taunted by one person, it's bad enough. But when it's piled on by lots and lots of people, that can be really damaging. Yeah. And so that was the kind of thing where we started to see some potential for people to argue with the rules and say, oh, this is not clear enough. So that's something that I think is really important in my role as legal, is like working with the team to try to figure out what are those gaps? How can we be really clear in our policies? And you even have laws now that are saying the acceptable use policies need to be very clear about what's okay and what's not. And so it's actually become a legal issue where, if you aren't clear and you start taking action on things and you don't say in your rules that this is not okay, well, then the user actually has a good argument to say, but I didn't do anything wrong. You didn't tell me that your platform doesn't allow, this kind of behavior. So it really is, it's, just better for everybody to have the expectations set and the rules clear and fair. And if people break the rules, then it's clear what happens. And that's sort of what the laws are moving in this direction of wanting to have that sort of a
more
approach.
specific.
Yeah.
So let's move on. There's a lot of things going on now, like laws coming out. The policies are moving fast. So what do you think it's so hard for lawmakers to come up with laws that work to make sure products are safe for kids?
That is a great question. I don't envy lawmakers in this space because technology is very hard to keep up with. As we all know, technology can move very fast. Lawmaking typically moves pretty slow. Even when people sort of all seem to have the same objective, let's all try to do more to protect kids. Let's do more to make sure that technology is going to be safe. It's very hard to get agreement on what exactly does that mean? How exactly are we going to do that? And then meanwhile, the technology has continued to evolve. And so sometimes you get a situation where by the time the law is passed, some new development has happened and companies aren't even using that thing anymore, or they knew that the law was getting so close to being passed that they're going to develop some other thing that's going to be outside of the scope of the law. And so that, they'll be able to continue to basically do whatever it was the law was trying to prevent, but in a way that's not illegal because they're not, they know what the law is prohibiting. And so they've
taken a way around, basically.
Yeah.
But like, why would they want to take a way around?
Well, so something like, say, cookies, with privacy, you have to accept cookies, right? Or you have to accept or reject the cookie banner in a lot of cases if there's tracking happening of your activity online. And so, when it became clear that cookies was going to be heavily regulated, there was going to be this banner required by the EU and strong enforcement. Some companies started to think, well, okay, cookies are to track people's activities on the web. Are there other ways I can either track or maybe use mobile tracking or do other things to try to get this, profile of the user and understand the user behavior without actually using cookies and tracking technologies, which we know are covered by these laws. And so they want to be able to track the users. They want to be able to use that information. And so once it's clear that cookies need to be accepted, you need consent to do that kind of tracking, there's an effort to find other ways to track behavior that don't fall within the scope of the law. Does that make sense?
Yes, so that you don't need the users.
You don't need their consent.
Yes.
Yeah, because you're not using a tracking technology like a cookie.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so what are some of the biggest challenges that companies face when having to comply with laws about online safety?
Yeah, well, this one, as I know you've covered in your podcast before, tech is not inherently bad. There are a lot of good things that we use technology for. And in some cases, many cases, tech can be really helpful for kids. And so, one thing is when you're trying to comply with these laws and figure out, how to promote online safety, you don't want to have your approach be so restrictive that like kids are never using any technology, right? You want to make sure that the good uses get used, but also that the bad, that the abuse doesn't happen. And that's tough. And so for companies that are trying to navigate these requirements, but also promote the good uses of their products, it can be hard to know what's okay sometimes because in order to draft a law that works across a lot of different products, you can't be that specific, because then it's like maybe only a few different companies are going to be in scope. So sometimes the law has to be written in sort of broader terms, but then you're sweeping up all these other products that might not actually be doing the bad thing that the lawmakers are worried about. And so that can be challenging. And then also as a company, you might find that like the situation as the law gets passed and whether you like it or not, or whether you think it's fair or not, you're in scope of this law. But the thing that you have to do actually takes a lot of engineering work or design resources or something for you to actually be able to comply. And it might not make that big a difference because maybe for your product, going back to GitHub, say, GitHub is not like a hotbed for viral activity that's like, terrible, like streaming, terrible content that some other platforms might have to be dealing with. And so, even though GitHub does take a very responsible approach, they do a lot of the things that are very pro safety, you could ask yourself, like, is that really the target of legislation? Or, were there other companies that are really more needing to do the kinds of things that the lawmakers are pushing for? Well, and to give you another example, let's say your product is in scope of this law, but when it comes to like what's the riskiest thing that people are doing with their product, where's the abuse coming from? Maybe it's really just the scams and financial things, people trying to scam people into like some cryptocurrency scheme or something. But the law is all about, having to develop tools that scan content before somebody posts it or whatever. That might be very, very valuable and important for certain platforms. But if what your users are dealing with is like financial fraud, that scanning of images might have like zero impact on that. And so you've had to now divert resources from really trying to deal with this important issue about the financial fraud that you don't want your users to have to deal with. But now the engineers that were going to be building a thing to, do more detection there now have to be diverted to come up with a new scheme to prevent, or to be scanning, images or something that, like, again, isn't really the problem that you tend to face. So it's hard to know how to do that right, because sometimes you don't want there to be the possibility that they could start to use your platform in a way that's sharing pictures or, doing things that these other companies are experiencing. But it's hard to know in the moment, what the best use of an engineering team is when it comes to that for every given company.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so what comes first, the feature or the law? In the sense that, imagine you have a company and you want to launch this new feature. How do the companies first check if there's a law like that would affect that feature? Like sending direct messages, or sharing the profile, or like companies sometimes have profiles, but that profile is yours and nobody can see it. But then maybe they decide they want the feature of friend invites, likes. How does it work? Does the company look into what do they need to comply with, or do they just develop it and then they comply with it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it comes down to, each company is different and takes its own approach. The companies that I've worked at, this is actually part of my role, where before the product is launched, as a lawyer in the safety space, you're looking at the relevant laws in the places, the jurisdictions where you operate, and you see, what do we need to do if we develop this kind of a product? And so, for example, when I was at Strava, we developed the direct messaging feature, and that enables users to have private communications with each other. And that was a big thing. I mean, from a legal perspective, there were a lot of concerns we had, because we said, well, what if we're now opening up ways for people to share images with each other on the platform? What could be in those images? Do we need to be scanning for those things, et cetera? And so we had a lot of conversations, and in the end, we decided to launch messaging to just have text, no images. And we took a very privacy forward approach by saying, you can't have just a complete stranger decide to send you a message. We looked at people's profile settings, and depending on if they had said only people who I've approved to follow me can see my activities, then we said, well, in the messaging context, that means only bidirectional followers can message each other. So basically only somebody who has said, I am following you and you are following me, you had to have that relationship in order to be able to send a private message. And so, that was just depending on what the user had chosen for their privacy settings, that helped us figure out what we wanted to do with messaging. And the other thing we did, which is very relevant to this podcast, is we said that if you're under 18, you can't use messaging. And so if you're a Strava user, and you're a minor, you don't see messaging come up when you're opening your Strava on your app. You don't see the messaging capability. And that was something we thought was important, because of, a lot of the laws were out there already saying you need to protect your, do something in your product to protect kids, and, sort of err on the side of design that is promoting kid safety. But also just in terms of wanting to minimize abuse on the platform, we realize that messaging is a riskier place to engage with users than elsewhere on the product. And so we wanted to kind of tread lightly into the messaging space and see how users are using it before we open it up to minors.
Can you remind us what Strava did or does?
Yeah, sorry. Strava is an app that people use to track activities. It's very common, for example, for like running or cycling. So you can say, oh, here's where I did my run, or I walked my dog, down this street today, and you can record that and post pictures of your cute dog, and you can like share it on your feed and kudos somebody to say great job, or write a comment and say, oh, that's such a cool trail, where is that, or whatever. And so it's like a nice social way for people to stay active. But in terms of the kids aspect of it, it's interesting too, because going back to the messaging example, when we said you can't use it if you're under 18, then we get some coaches of like track teams and cross country teams writing in to say, well, I want my team to use Strava and I want to be able to message them and that sort of thing. And it's like, well, okay, so maybe there are, things down the road that Strava will decide to do in order to, expand the capabilities for certain use cases. But you can see sometimes when you're launching a product, you kind of have to make a decision about what's the safest way for us to like wade into this space, and can we watch and see a little bit, and then like add on to the offering later based on what we see. So I think that was important.
Yeah, and what you mentioned at the beginning, like we need to make the laws, or lawmakers are tending to make the laws more specific, so that the more specific, then the user is more guided. And then imagine in Strava if they said, well, for users under 18, only messaging is allowed if a user over 18 is, you have to have the Teams feature. I don't know. And then maybe you develop that Teams feature, and then you make a special policy just for that.
Right. Like having, right? Yeah. I mean, that goes to like from the beginning, you're asking about what do trust and safety teams do, and what the preventive side of it is. It's a lot of that. It's like, well, then, if we, let's say there is enough of a demand for the ability to have under 18 users use messaging in certain cases, then what would that look like? What would we be able to build that would still be safe, that we feel like has like the right level of safety features? And so would it be that like, there needs to be the coach and the coach is over 18, like, but only the coach can send, like how would we do it? Would we have certain rules or features in place? But then, in reality, it's like, yes, in a world of endless resources, it would be great to be able to launch messaging and have like the feature for coaches and but there's a finite amount of things to do with the product. And so will that be is there enough demand for that? Or will it just sort of be like, maybe, create a club, because Strava also has clubs. So like the coach should just write the message in the club and not have a direct message. Sometimes it's like people look at the shiny new thing and they're like, I want to use messages for all these things. But it's like, well, another thing you can do from a safety perspective, honestly, is steer people away from the riskier product feature. Like this example, we could say, hey, why don't you use this product in a different place? You can post that message. If you're just trying to tell the team to show up at practice an hour early, it doesn't need to be a direct private message. You can post it in the Strava club that you created that is a more open forum.
Yeah, so you have to balance resources, legal, and what makes sense for the business, basically. Yeah, makes sense. So let's change gears a little bit. I'm really curious about the international scenario. How do different international legal standards affect tech companies that operate globally? Does that mean that children in different countries access different types of digital content? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating topic. It will depend on the company, honestly. I think each company is going to take the approach that makes sense for the company. But, you mentioned globally operating companies. And so, yeah, I mean, if companies decide that they want to serve users all over the world, then they should be paying attention to the rules, the laws in various parts of the world. And so depending on what kind of product you have and what users are able to do with it, and where you're operating, you might find that you need to think about either having your rules be a sort of baseline where you're not going to go beyond what any one country would allow, or you might make some decisions like, okay, there's this country, maybe it's a very oppressive government that has certain rules, and you're like, well, this is not a major market for us. And if it came down to it, if that country were to say, you know what, we don't agree with what you're doing here, then you might leave that market. Like Russia is an example where a lot of countries have said, even before the war, some countries were like, I don't want to comply with the Russia data localization policies or other things and just say, you know what, I'm not even going to try to be available in Russia. And if the Russian government cuts us off, then okay, we'll just won't be there. So, I mean, that's, straying a bit from your question about kids specifically, but it's relevant in the sense that if countries are really focused on kids and have a more restrictive approach, the company's going to have that same set of questions to ask themselves about, like, okay, do we need to change our product so that at least in that place we're only displaying certain kinds of content? Or that actually takes a lot of work a lot of times to build. Like, most companies aren't going to have like a one country specific version of their product. So because they're globally operating, then they might need to say, okay, are we going to make changes across the board so that no kid anywhere in the world is going to see this type of a thing?
Okay, so you try to make it globally accessible for all countries, and I'm guessing you're complying with the most restrictive country that you decide to comply with, right? Like, let's say I don't know this. Like, is more restrictive than the US, and if you want to go into the EU market, then you will just use their laws because they're more restrictive than the US. And I'm making this up 100%.
It's a great example, actually, because if we think about something like GDPR, which I think a lot of people have probably heard of, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, which revolutionized data privacy in 2018 when it came into effect, because its requirements go beyond what other countries had in place at the time in terms of what kinds of rights you needed to uphold for your users, in terms of access to their information and that sort of thing. And so companies had to decide, like, am I going to have an EU specific product? Is it going to be like only if you're in the EU and you're a user, then we do these things for you? Or do we say, like, globally, we're going to take this approach? And a lot of companies have decided that, you know what, no matter where you are in the world, you're going to get the EU standard, because we're not going to build an EU product and a US product and a Brazil product and a Japan product. I mean, it's just, we're having one product. And if we think that, like, it makes sense to comply with GDPR, then they decide that everybody gets the same treatment if they're not in the EU. Yeah. But some companies might be big enough or have reason to say, you know what, we're going to prioritize and make sure we know it's easy for us to detect that this is an EU user. And so we're going to put them in the EU bucket and, like, treat it differently than if it's somebody writing in from the US. Some companies do take that approach and can take that approach. But for a lot of companies, it might not be that obvious. Is the user actually in the EU? Because maybe they don't collect the information in the first place to know where they are. Different companies collect different kinds of information. Different companies know different kinds of things about their users. And so that comes into play also when you're dealing with different countries. It's like, how easy is it for you to even tailor content to different people, different countries, if you don't necessarily know where they are or where they're going to be seeing it or where it's going to be shared, Yeah.
I was just thinking about the social media companies. I think there's differences in the EU and in the US on the way.
Yeah, I do think that some of the big companies have the capabilities to have a different version of their product, or China's another market where maybe the product looks different there or has different rules that they're following. But again, if you're a small company, it's hard to do that kind of thing. And so the size of the company and the nature of the product definitely matter for how different it's going to be.
And what about privacy? How does children's privacy come into play in this whole scenario?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. We talked a lot about safety, a little bit about privacy, but not so much kids' privacy, right? So yeah, totally. I mean, a lot of policymakers are focused these days on kids' privacy specifically. And you see laws that are saying the design of the product needs to take into account, it needs to be age appropriate in terms of the design, and that the handling of kids' information needs to be very controlled. And so, we're definitely seeing that come up a lot. We're also seeing certain things like age verification requirements. And that one I think is interesting because, if you think about, we have that for a lot of sites that are alcohol related, where it's, are you 21 or not, so that's what, when I say age verification, a lot of times it's like that, where you see like the thing pop up, are you 18? And if the approach is just ask the question, as it's very easy to lie. Some kids are going to be sort of, it will work for some kids. Some kids are not going to lie, or they're going to feel like someone's going to find out if they lie or something. And so there is some value to that for sure, but it's not foolproof because, kids can lie. And so that's a challenge, because if that's the requirement, you always run the risk that maybe it's not going to be followed properly. But then what's another approach? You could say, okay, because somebody could lie, we're going to have the kid provide us like their government issued ID and take a live selfie, et cetera. And now you're collecting kids' information. And that's what I was saying a minute ago. Some of these laws are really focused on is not collecting, minors' information any more than you'd need to. And then it's like, well, you can say you need to in order to verify their age, but then it's like, is that worth it? Because now the company has a right, they sort of have that information. And if they're doing everything right, they're not going to use it for anything else. But you always run the risk that once it's on their systems, once it's on the servers, whether by accident or not, then there's always the chance that that photo gets shared or used for something else, So in some cases, it might be safer just to say, let's run the risk that they lie, and see where it goes. And I'm not really taking a position on either approach. I'm just trying to lay out the pros and cons there, that it's not an easy one, right? It's like you could think of different approaches, but neither one is perfect. And so I think that's part of why you see some stalling in some of these laws where it's like not obvious what the best way is,
And so, because then if you store kids' information like the ID, then different laws apply or no, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, then the privacy laws like GDPR and other laws, then there's some newer laws too that do focus on kids' data. These laws do apply. So, I mean, again, if companies are doing everything right and these laws are written in the right way, then in theory it should be fine, because you're only collecting that image of the kid for as long as you need to verify it, and then you're deleting it or destroying it and making sure nobody else in the company can use it for anything. I mean, that's generally how these things would be designed. But in practice, it's hard sometimes, especially for smaller companies. They might not have the engineering resources or software, designed in a way that they can actually ensure that like that information is walled off or is immediately deleted. And I mean, maybe some smaller companies can. I don't want to scare you from using small company products, but some of the laws are kind of assuming that it's easy to do these things, or companies can do these things. And in some cases, maybe the bigger companies are better able to handle it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, because there's costs behind storing all that information around safety.
Yeah.
Around server safety and stuff like that, correct?
Yeah.
That makes sense. So, what practical advice would you give parents regarding like using tools safety? Do we have to read the whole contract? Like instead of clicking I accept, what practical tools, what parents, as you as a parent, what would you look at when, having your kid uses software?
Yeah. I mean, I think, that's asking a lot to say, read the terms of service and privacy policy cover to cover and see what you think. But if you are inclined to look, I mean, a lot of companies' products will have like an acceptable use policy or community guidelines or this kind of thing. And that can be interesting. That can be helpful for you as a parent to look at and just get a sense of how is the company communicating, what their rules are. Are they specifically saying you can't use the product for certain things? You can't post certain kinds of content that makes sense to you? Are you seeing things that are not on that list that you're like, how come, like pornography is not on the list or something? This might give you a sense of like what's okay on this platform and what's not, if you care about certain things, right? So that might be somewhere to look and just see, hey, what are the rules on this product? But I would also just say, if you're thinking about letting your kid use, say, a social media app or something, it's probably a good idea you yourself to just, play around with it a bit and see things like, how easy is it for someone to add you as a friend? What are the default settings? Like, go to the privacy settings and see what are all the things that you can decide to allow or not. In a lot of cases, the default checkboxes are going to be that people can see your stuff or post, mention you, but all those things. And some of the stuff might be totally fine and you might not be worried about it, but it's important for you to kind of just understand, I think, what the settings allow you to control. Who can see what you post, for example? Like, is there a way to restrict that sort of thing so that only people that can see? And also, if bullying and harassment is an issue, which it is with a lot of kids, thinking about the ways that some of those features can be controlled so that, if if someone is going to say something that's going to upset your kid, like how you can kind of contain some of the activity around that so that the whole class, so that the whole world doesn't start, egging on whoever's being mean to your kid or something. So that's something. I mean, virality is another thing you might be concerned about, like how easy it is for someone to post something on that platform and have it go viral. If there's a picture, someone takes a picture of your kid and then shares it, is that going to be for the whole world to see, or is it going to be for like 3 kids in their friend group, max, that are going to see that? So, there's certain things like that might just be useful for you to poke around and look at. So that way, when you say to your kid, like, you can use this, you can already tell them certain things that you might say. You can use it, but make sure, allow this, that, and the other, or whatever other rules, you might think are good.
Yeah, makes sense. Yep. Thank you. So yeah, we're getting towards the end, but I'm going to ask you one more. Are there any recent legal developments or trends that give you hope for improved digital safety for kids?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about some of the challenges, but I do think that there's some hope. I do think it's encouraging that so many policymakers and also the general public is concerned about the state of, kids' exposure, especially to social media. And so I think that there's like the will to do things. And even though it is hard to find the right set of requirements for a law to work, I have seen some things recently, like bills and laws that are focused on features, things like addictive feeds, spelling out like the addictive part of a product. Instead of just saying, if you allow users to communicate with each other, you have to do all these things. It's really focused more on like, is there a feed that's like a never-ending scroll? Do you get notifications at all hours of the night? Like, all these kinds of things that are really designed to have like that dopamine effect where the kid is just like glued to their phone and or really potentially going to be developing these kinds of addictive relationships with the product. So I think that's encouraging to see that more narrow focus and really trying to get at like what are the things that are causing the negative effects that we're seeing with kids.
Yeah, that's hopeful. And when we were chatting before actually starting recording, you mentioned comparison between driving a car with no brakes and driving a car with brakes. Can you tell the audience about that? Because I love that. That's a very like visual way of how, to see the whole legal structure around these products.
Yeah. We were chatting because I was mentioning that I had gone to a privacy conference last year, and during the keynote, they talked about how the first cars were designed without brakes. And so, obviously after a very short period of time, people started getting hurt, and the car makers realized it was like in their best interest and everybody's best interest to build the car with brakes. It doesn't mean that you're driving with your brakes on all the time and you're going, super slow all the time, but it meant that in order to be able to go faster in the car, you did have these brakes so you could slow yourself down when you needed it. And so I think that's like a great, when I think about trust and safety, that's what a lot of the preventive side of thing is, like building those brakes, like figuring out what are the brakes that you need, getting those built before you release the product, and then like educating users on how to use them. And I think that's where, Patricia, you are sort of bringing out this really interesting point about you don't give the kids the keys to the car, right, without teaching them.
Exactly. You got to teach them to drive and use the brakes. And the law in this case is kind of the brakes, right? Like you need,
or the speed limit might be, there's something.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not enough. Right?
That's not enough. The law is not enough. Yeah. Talking to kids, communicating, having an open and genuine conversation with kids about how to use all these tools, social media, and not only social media, anything tech related. It's the way to grow with them and to empower them as adults, because when communication is so key. So yeah, I love that analogy. Well, thank you, Abby, for a great conversation. It was incredibly interesting, and I hope the audience enjoyed it and gained valuable insights. I believe that shining a light into the trust and safety world is crucial to understanding how the products our children interact with are built. Your perspectives on the role of trust and safety teams in tech really were truly enlightening. My key takeaway then is that lawmakers alone aren't going to solve the major issues affecting our children. There is definitely much that needs to improve on the regulation side, but open and non-judgmental communication with our children, conversations within our communities, alignment with school, teachers, and even alignment among parents within our communities remains the most effective tools we parents have at this point.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I do feel like trust and safety is often a behind the scenes kind of part of the product, but it's really important and really, I think, helpful for people, especially if they're concerned about safety, to understand more how companies are approaching this kind of thing. But also do really appreciate the recognition that the law isn't going to solve the problems. That the law is one thing, but yes, educating the kids, working with the kids, and what you're doing with this podcast is really great for that. It's just helping parents understand better how they can work with their kids and make a better experience for everybody.
That's what I'm hoping, yes. Finally, if you enjoyed this episode, share it with other parents who are exploring similar questions. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate your interest in helping your kids navigate the digital world thoughtfully.